Now, I'm sure you know that autobiography is more interesting to the person that's making the presentation than it is to anybody else. But I appreciate the kind words of introduction that have been made. I count myself a third generation of the servants of the Lord. My maternal grandfather gave the land on which the church building in our community, which was Midlothian, Texas, was built. And it was a creed in the deed type of situation. It is the deed said that if an instrument of music was ever brought into the building, why the land would revert to his heirs. Of course, that got into trouble when they got ready to build a new building on another location and wanted to get rid of that piece of property to do that. They couldn't give a clear deed to the land. But anyhow, that was popular back in his day. Now, I don't have any information that goes back in ancestry beyond that particular point. My mother was a charter member of the Midlothian congregation, and it now is over 100 years old. But my father was a convert as an adult out of the Methodist Church. And as time went along, he became a deacon in the congregation, and then still later an elder, before he was called home at the early age of 64. But the church in Midlothian, I owe a great debt to. And my mother's relatives had a very important role in the building of that congregation. I heard rumors that they were members in Indiana before they ever moved into Texas, but I really don't know anything about that stage of the family. Go by. But Uncle Isaac in the church there got up fairly often and urged the young men to memorize scripture. He had a plan by which, if you memorized so many verses every day, why, over a period of time, you'd know the whole New Testament. Well, that kind of made sense with me. And so I began memorizing the King James Version. That, of course, was the only version we knew anything about back at that period of time. In the hot Texas summer sun, we had to let the team rest at the end of the row in order to keep them overheating them. It was really a boring type of time to sit there and wait for them to get cooled off. Nothing except birds flying overhead and airplanes. I wasn't very interested in birds, but airplanes was another thing. But anyhow, that was a time in which I could learn passage of scripture. I well remember when the first salesman came to our house to try to sell us an American Standard Version. And we listened to what she had to say and the peculiarities of the American Standard. And for sure, we weren't going to buy any. But I remember that quite well. But as I said, I owe a great debt to the congregation. I completed the 11th grades at the public school in Midlothian, and then went to ACC. It was a college then, and not a university as it is at the present time. My freshman Bible teacher was Homer Haley, and he was a convert out of the Instrumental Church. He preached for the Fifth and Highland Church in Abilene in addition to teaching Bible. And he had a fabulous rote memory of Scripture and a way of really inspiring young men to become the kind of preacher that he was. Now, I didn't have any idea of becoming a preacher when I went to Abilene. And they had a speaker one time that said, if you're going to be a preacher, you have to plan to be a scholar all of your life. And my reaction to that was, if there's anything I don't want to do, why, that's it. But as time goes on, things like that can have a change. But he was a very stimulating teacher. And of course encouraged others to study that sort of way. Later on, he got a master's degree at Southern Methodist, and his thesis was Attitudes and Consequences. This book contrasts the attitude about authority had by the people that use instrumental music as contrasted to the people that didn't use instrumental music. I devoured that book, and even today, if somebody is interested in the matter of authority and where it leads you to, I would recommend that as a book that you ought to read. Now, after that, we had in Abilene the teacher the next year, and he was Charles Robertson. He had the only doctor's degree that any of the faculty at Abilene had at the time that I was there. When I was there, there were about 900 students in the school. Abilene would have more than that number of teachers at the present time. But he'd earned a degree in Koine Greek at the University of Texas. He taught second year Bible, and it was basically writing his notes on the board. There wasn't any Xerox back at that time, and you copied the notes, and he explained them. And of course, the examinations were over what he had said. Well, he had a program by which, if you memorize a certain number of scripture, why you were exempt from examination. He furnished the list, and you learned and recited to the proctor that he had appointed. Now, at Abilene at that time, the American Standard Version was the standard text that was being made use of. Now, I'd always rather to memorize than to take an examination. So I learned a lot more scripture at that period of time. And the American Standard. When I got started preaching, that was the Bible that I taught out of, preached out of, and came to know a great deal about it. Later on, I had a teacher that worked on the Revised Standard Version, and so I was swung over to that idea. And, even to this good day, when I'm asked to write an article and it's specified what translation you're supposed to use, I always have to go back and look carefully to make sure that I stay with that translation. If I'm running a passage of scripture that I don't know the location of, I'm going to use a King James concordance to find that passage of scripture. Now, I know that the other translations have concordances, and I own one or two of them, but I know the wording that needs to be looked up better in the King James form than I do in the other form. There it is. Now, Robertson didn't have never said anything that I heard about continuing one's education, but he had a fabulous number of his students that went on for additional education by some stimulus or other. We happen to be born just at the transition period in church history, as far as our congregation is concerned. After that period of time, people that went for advanced degrees, studied in history or education or something of that sort, because that was safe. And additional Bible education was thought of as being dangerous to their faith. And so that was the general spirit that was voting at that period of time. I finished the program there and went right out to Throckmorton, Texas to preach as a beginning preacher. Stayed there for a year, then moved to Huntsville, Texas, where Sam Houston Teachers is located. And I did a master's degree in English while I was preaching for the congregation there. So I learned a great deal more. I wrote a thesis on use of poems in sermons, which was accepted for that particular case. I preached on the radio there as well as also the pulpit. I sort of set a pattern of doing more than one thing at one time during the time that I was there. Well, along about that time, my older brother had gone to Harding Divinity School. I said Harding, I meant Harvard Divinity School, and had for 3 years, and had gotten himself the first degree that Harvard offers. And the war was on, and if you had a deferment from the draft, it wasn't hard to get into Harvard. Today, it would be hard to get in to meet the entrance requirements, but it was easy back at that time. And at Harvard, you had a general program in which you prepared in 6 fields for the examination. This included early church history, later church history, New Testament, Old Testament, theology, and the history of religions. And at the end of that program, you had to take a 3-hour examination in 1 week. There's 6 days out of the week, but a 3-hour examination each day over one or the other of these 6 fields. And then the next week, you had an oral examination in which you could raise your grade, but you couldn't lower it for anything that you had to say. So all that was necessary to get the first degree, which is the Bachelor of Scientific Theology, STB. And that represented about 3 or 4 years' work that one had to do. Now, this was a whole new world as far as I was concerned. For church history, we had an Italian Catholic who I think it was an ex-Catholic at that period of time, who had a very heavy accent. And so he lectured on church history. One of the stories that floated around was that he gave a sermon, a lesson on Abelard's sick at noon, and the student came out of the class with notes about a sick nun. Well, in that time, he had an assistant that sat it about the board, and if you missed a word, you could hold up your hand and he'd write the word on the board, and thereby you could understand what he had to say. Lapiana created in me an interest in church history that's never died. It's a very fascinating subject. Abilene had no courses for that at all. Now, at that period of time, there were a lot of GI meetings for church around cities in New England as well as the rest of the world where we had no congregation. I had obligated myself to work with a small group of people meeting in Providence, Rhode Island. We met in the downtown district in one of the small rooms in the Biltmore Hotel. It was right located at the transportation center. A very convenient, congenial place to have a meeting. Harvard offered student aid, which they call compensated church work. You picked out your work you wanted to do, and then they paid some of your fees for doing that. My wife was intending to work. She had secretarial skills, and she got on at Raytheon for that period of time. Now, Providence was about 1 hour by train out of Boston, and we went down on Sunday and also on Wednesday for that work. But the congregation had one lady who was a native New Englander, school teacher, and one lady who was there because her husband had a job, a war job in Providence, and he wasn't a member. And all the rest of the people that came were GIs or their wives, and most of the GIs had come back from the war and were awaiting discharge. So there was a continuous change in population in the congregation. Now, I was there for 7 years, and at the largest, we had 35 in the meeting. And at the smallest, about 6, including myself and my wife. But it was an interesting and a very challenging type of work. You know, if you go into a town where there are no people that are members of the church, how do you find people to teach in order to preach teach the gospel to them? Abilene didn't really give any training for meeting that sort of problem, and I never found any real answer to it. It was a very frustrating type of thing. I was told that there would be a congregation in Providence when the war was over, and I was determined the other way around at that point. Well, we had been there 4 years while we found a building in the best area of town and bought it for $400. And there's some about that amount of money had to be spent to get it ready for use. And so Providence did have a congregation and did have a building. When that time, the 7 years that I was there had gone by. Now, later on, when our country built the expressways came through the area, and the building was taken by the expressway. But that money was acquired out of it, that the congregation was able to build a new building in a very lovely suburban area out of East Providence. And that building still is in existence, and the congregation meets there and makes use of it. There also was another part of the congregation that went to another type of suburb, and I haven't had any contact with them since that period of time. Well, today, if you went to Rhode Island, you'd find that there are 7 congregations that are meeting in various locations, as compared to, for all practical purposes, none back at that period of time. Our church has grown a great deal in Rhode Island, Rhode Island, and also all of New England during these years that have lapsed since the war was over, as people became interested in doing mission work in that part area of town. Now, I was in a situation where, I was devoting an awful lot more time to church work than I needed to do if I was going to be a credible student in Harvard Divinity School. Now, in the Old Testament, we had Robert Pfeiffer, who was a rank liberal, but he had written the book that at that period of time was the book that people used in other schools in studying the introduction to the Old Testament. And it was a very challenging and interesting program. When we came near the end of the program for examination time, Pfeiffer said that he realized the fact that there were a number of fundamentalist students in the class, and the examination was not going to be over what you believe. It was going to be over what we covered in the class. This is pretty well the way that things went as far as Harvard examinations are concerned. They never had an exam that I had any contact with where you had an answer to the questions that were being asked. No such thing as true and false and all that sort of follies. But your first reaction when you saw the examination question was, I never heard anything like that in my whole life. I don't know anything about what that's being asked about. But once you got over your fear and sat and thought for a while, you were expected to come up with a logical presentation that would cover questions that the class had covered. It really was an exam of what you can do with what you learned, rather than answering a specific question that somebody had asked. Now, in my teaching career, I've tried that once or twice, and discovered that the students don't have a ghost of a notion of what they're supposed to do. they've been used to questions that have the direct answer out of the page on the book or something of that sort, not making use of what they had learned. But Harvard was a open atmosphere at that period, and a great many of my fellow students became the leaders in the evangelical movement. They were the teachers who founded Fuller and who taught in Gordon Conwell and other fundamentalists or students schools at the present time. So it was a very challenging thing. We had other teachers that also were very, very interesting. Now, Henry Cadbury was New Testament professor, and he was a Quaker. They called themselves Friends, but he was a leader in the American Friends. And when the Friends were granted a Nobel Prize for their work, peace work, during the war period, he was the one who went to Oslo to receive the prize for the Friends. He was a champion of the Socratic type method. It all was discussion, directed discussion, back and forth. And I learned, or rather more than I'd known before, that the fellow that knew the least in the class was the one who was going to do the most talking. And thereby I got my definition of discussion classes as the pooling of ignorance. But when a person had presented his case that he was quite sure was lock, stock, and barrel, in the most puzzling type of way, Cadbury would say, "Now I wonder." And the whole thing would just collapse right into, further dealing with the information that we ought to be dealing with at that period of time. He was a gentleman, if there ever was one. My advisor was Arthur Darby Knock. Knock was a British genius who had only a master's degree. And somebody asked him one day why he didn't get a doctorate, and his answer was, "Well, who would examine me?" He had a photographic memory, and the way that he cited anything was, it's on page so-and-so, 3/4 of the way down the page. It is, he had the book open as far as the mind's eye was concerned, and he was seeing the information in that way. Well, he suggested that, as my advisor, that I come see him after I'd been in school for a month, and I did. I found the dormitory in which he had space. It was all taken up by the military, except his own quarters. And I got the impression that he definitely had forgotten that I was going to come at that particular time. He asked me about how things were going, and he asked me about what I'd preached about the preceding Sunday, and if I knew how much work it took for a person to write an introduction to the New Testament of the type that he happened to be citing. I found an office in which there was a fabulous number of books in the bookcases on the wall. There also was a large stack of books on top of the desk with no space at all left there. The chairs were full of books. And Knock had the little drawer of the desk pulled out, and that's what he set his place in this situation. Well, after a few more niceties, then it was time to go. And I got the impression that neither of us were sorry about that time arriving. I didn't need any further advice as far as that's the rest of was concerned. And that took care of the whole problem of advisors. Well, after I'd done the first degree, why, it now was time to do the classwork and so on for the doctorate. Well, before that, Harvard had another scholarship grant called Hopkins Shares. Now, what are Hopkins Shares? Well, there was a person in the Revolutionary period named Edward Hopkins, a Britisher, who left his fortune for the education of preachers in New England. And that fund was furnishing money that was used for students in my day. It was a rather desirable grant that one paid. Now and then I got a check from the charity of Edward Hopkins. That's the way that I was able to continue in my education. You had to take a class from the history of religions. I chose the Lutheran religion. You had to work in classical Greek. Since it was 2 hours from my place to Harvard campus, I didn't see fit to study Greek when I got to take it at Brown University, which was in town, Providence. So I took that to transfer back to Harvard for the degree. And of course, then there was German and there was French that he dealt with. I ordered in an opening class in German, which had a German teacher, got the books, read the material, and passed the examination. Then, come one summer, I said, now come fall, I'm going to pass French. So I bought the books and I bought the vocabulary card. There weren't any tapes back then that you'd find very early. And so I learned enough French to pass the exam. I don't have any notion at all how it sounds. And I couldn't carry on any conversation in it. Well, the ways in which I cut the tape along the way, I paid for in the fact that I never got into either one of these languages where I could read just any article that you want to put out. But you see, it was examination over translation and not over carrying on conversation that they were involved in this case. Well, here again, now we finally get to the time for choosing a thesis. And Knock was the person that you had to deal with. He was agitated at my indecision. I really hadn't found any topic in the seminars that I'd taken and go on that I thought would do for a thesis topic. So I was wasting his time. He threw out, why don't you do a thesis on Christian interpretation of Jewish works and study the Testament of the 12 patriarchs? Well, my reaction was, if the Testament of the 12 patriarchs will get me out of this place, that's where it's going to be. I didn't know what the Testament of the 12 patriarchs were. I never heard of them. I didn't know they existed or anything of that sort. But I did write the thesis, and it was accepted, and it's never been published. It now has been bypassed by more recent studies. It will be published. But in that way, the various demands were met. So I had a degree in scientific theology, which representatives work in various fields, the 6 fields I mentioned to begin with. Now, in my last year at Harvard, I saw on the bulletin board that the Hebrew Union College was beginning an interfaith program in which they had scholarships available. And at that time, I was still in the thesis process. I thought, well, now this is the way that I can get the time to write the thesis. So I applied and was accepted and went to Cincinnati for that program. But I discovered that this class was an 18-hour course in Hebrew. That was, in fact, was a leveling course for everybody. So that's what I was expected to do. This included Martin Hebrew. It included Hebrew grammar. It included the Hebrew Bible and Hebrew literature. I got in that program, and as we went along, I was struggling for air once again. I still was preaching on Sundays, and I was committed to the Garrett Street Church in Covington, Kentucky, which is just across the river from Cincinnati. I told the teacher of the class that I'd understood that when Jewish mothers had trouble with their children, Instead of threatening them with hell, they threatened them, they'd send them to Hebrew Union College. Hebrew leveling in this sort of way. So I endured that. Well, it was an interesting atmosphere. We didn't study the Old Testament. We studied Bible. It went from Genesis to Revelation, but it wasn't Old Testament in the language of that community. Hebrew Union College had rescued a number of Jewish scholars out of Germany, where they would have been endangered in Hitler's activity was carried on. And one of these that was an outstanding personality was Judas Levy. Levy had a very heavy German accent, though of course he could speak English. He also smoked a black cigar, and the students joked about the fact that you had to pass the smoke test in order to do the passage. Well, I took under him a class on the book of Hosea, and I also had a class in Ugaritic and a class in Aramaic. And this again was a rather interesting experience. Levi chided me for my slowness for saying, well, if you don't remember what you learned, what do you study for? And in this class in Aramaic, here was a student that he was chiding. And so the student reacted back, well, Dr. Levi, you're a genius. And indeed, that was true. But Levi came back at him to say, I wasn't born a genius. I became that way by hard work. But I'm not a linguist. I've been through an awful lot of languages by just blood and sweat. Not by the fact you just pick them up automatically, as some students seem to do. Later on, I met Levi at a scholarly meeting. I apologized for having been so slow in his classes. And with great gentleness, he said, that's not the way that I remember it. But there were other students that were there, and it was a very interesting place. We took a biblical book and studied that book out of the Hebrew Bible. Sheldon Blank was teaching the prophets, and it was a very interesting class from his viewpoint in that way. And then they had teachers that taught in the Hellenistic area, and also was interesting. This teacher said one day that there shouldn't be any such thing as Christian scholarship and Jewish scholarship. That the only thing that was legitimate was just scholarship, not divided by these two ways. Of course, that's a true approach to the field. He had an interest in students, and I enjoyed classes with him. At Hebrew Union College, the examinations were somewhat like those at Harvard. It wasn't an examination over what you believe, but an examination over the material that had been covered in the class. And so you didn't come up against a faith problem into that period of time. Now, while all of this was going on, Harding College began to think about the need in the church for additional education in Bible beyond just the BA degree that the schools had before. And so W.D. West had been to Pepperdine as a teacher and had a master's degree program later. And then came to Harding also to start the same type of program. And so they needed a teacher. And I moved from Hebrew Union then to Searcy for that point. People at Searcy were very proud of their location and all of that. And the advertising said it was conveniently located in all parts of the United States by rail, automobile, and air transportation. And when I got there, on one occasion, I had a way to react to that. And I said in chapel to the students, this means it takes all of them to get here. As far as West is concerned, he was on the railroad that went to Chicago, and Chicago was all parts of the United States. That's the way we got around that. After about 2 years at Harding, West was determined that we'd move up to a 3-year program. And to change any program or to begin any program, it was necessary to get a favorable vote of the entire Harding faculty. For some reason or other, and I think the best reason is people fear what they don't understand. And so nobody had a precedent of a school that would offer 3 years in Bible education. They talked about the fact that this education would kill the mission spirit the church had. It would also determine other programs that they hadn't implemented. So in the end, the 3-year program was voted down. And so, this was a dead end as far as that school is concerned. But it happened just at that period of time that the campus in Memphis became available. So in what might be called an end run around the Harding faculty, then the school was moved from Searcy to Memphis. You see, the Harding Graduate School really started in 52. And I came there in 54, but it was 52. But it was in 58 when we first opened in Memphis. The faculty in the graduate faculty was very small. There weren't enough graduate students at the school just for graduates. There were quite a number of young people that still had some undergraduate work to do in order to be able to begin a graduate program. So our classes, to start with, offered both undergraduate credit and graduate credit, depending on how much work the teacher demanded of the students. Now, for some classes, this meant that you read one extra book. But my idea was, if you're going to call this graduate work, it ought to be graduate work. The first fall that I was in Memphis, I had the Gospel of Matthew in a class. It had graduate students, and it had undergraduate students, and it also had a large crew of volunteers, non-credit students from churches. The classes were open to the congregation in this sort of way. And I reacted that if this is going to be a graduate class, it's going to be on the graduate level. I'm sure you can understand that we had fewer students at the end of the semester than we did to start in that type of situation. And I had a reputation of being impractical out of the number of students that dropped the class because they didn't understand what it was that was going on. Now, with a small faculty, every class that we offered had to have somebody to teach it. And after some years had gone by, in a time which I was somewhat antagonist or losing my cool, I carried out that I had taught 33 subject classes over the course of those years. Many of these would have been no more than just staying ahead of the students, outlining the class and staying ahead of the students. If you go to a school like Harvard, you have the world authorities as your teacher. That wasn't true in our early days, I'm sorry to say. But every aspect of graduate work had to be hammered out in this situation. What kind of a load of classes does a teacher carry if she's a graduate teacher as compared to an undergraduate teacher? And when a teacher is taught 7 years, how does the class go? Now, the undergraduate colleges all knew about helping a teacher go to school to finish his degree. That wasn't the question. But what do you do with the fellow who already has a degree? And the time has come for him to have a sabbatical. Well, you see, the sabbatical practice had to be hammered out into the schedule at that period. Do you take a sabbatical in the fall of the year or the spring of the year? In a university, ordinary university, you get the whole year off. But our school is thinking in the other terms. And furthermore, the fall of the year is when all the races take place for the year. And across the board, so such a percentage of raise every year. What about the fellow that's not on hand at that particular time? Does he lose out in this raise and be behind 1 year for the rest of his career? You see, the number of practical problems were came up that had to be dealt with. And of course, as the school grew and the faculty grew, we were able to have a more of a person that knew about what he was teaching to teach the various classes that took place. I guess I might as well tell my favorite story. The time that Dr. West persuaded me and enthused me for the fact that we needed to have Aramaic taught in our class, in our school. And he was going to get the students and I was going to do the teaching. And it sounded like that, the world sort of ran on there. Now, back at that time, pretty shortly after the war, there were no books in Aramaic that you could get, no grammars, anything of that sort, that you could get to teach out of. Now, at Hebrew Union, I'd had a handmade book that had been done by the teacher that gave the basic elements of grammar. So what did I do? I copied that beginning grammar on the old type of paper that you put on the machine and made a new copy. No Xerox back at that period. I got so enthusiastic about the possibilities of that in the number of years that we're going to have classes in that I did 100 syllabi on that class. If you would go through my stack of junk, you'd find that there's still about 90 syllabi. After these years have all gone by. But, it was an interesting experience that has taken place. We see every aspect of graduate study had to be worked out, every detail in this sort of way. You've always been ahead of Abilene as far as library resources are concerned. And that still would be true. Some time ago, people from Ibaraki College in Japan wanted to get data on the history of their school and the Memphis Road in there. Where did they go to find that type of information? Well, the Harlan Graduate School Library. Now and then, a teacher in one of the other colleges has a research project to carry out. And so we have these people also that are researching. But you see, the diverse type of training that I went through, as scattered as it was, put me in a position to be able to serve the Lord in this sort of way. I haven't developed where I'm an expert in any particular field, but just a dabbler in this area the other way. And the ball has bounced, and I've been able to catch it as the time went along. At Hebrew College, I got interested in the canon of Scripture. And so out of school, I began to think about that problem. And at that time, everybody knew that the canon of the Old Testament was closed at the Council of Jamnia about 90 AD. I began to research to try to find what we knew about that council and the details about it. Well, the longer I searched, the smaller the area became. And finally ended up that there really is only one passage in the Mishnah that on the basis, which is the basis of the whole idea. and discovered that there's nothing in that text that says about weighing the various books and choosing the few against the many. Nothing about the Apocrypha, anything of that sort. So I wrote an article which I read at the Society of Biblical Literature on what do we mean by Jamnia. Now I spelled it Jamnia because that's the way that my teacher at Harvard pronounced the word. And I really was asking for information and just admitting that that there's no this is made out of clear air. There really is no details about any canon being closed at this passage of literature. Well, when I read the paper, I got the treatment that everybody that reads the paper hopes he won't get. And that is complete silence. Nobody had a question to ask. No discussion, anything of that sort. Henry Cadbury told me that I had read it before the New Testament group, and I should have read it before the Old Testament group. And I suppose that was so. But, without my intention, this became a turning point in the discussion. And if you look in the lesser-known encyclopedias, you'll find that I'm given credit for establishing or removing the world the idea that the Council of Jamnia closed the canon of the Old Testament. But it all was just an accident that I fell into. Later on along the way, I found out that New York University was furnishing scholarships to spend 3 months in Israel. And the government was furnishing the money out of the Lend-Lease program. Lend-Lease is what my teacher called it back at Harvard. But anyhow, I applied for that and got to go to Jerusalem for a summer, and then a second summer. That's responsible for the number of trips that I have made to the Holy Land with leading groups since that time. And that runs up into beyond 30 different times that I've been over there. So that served my interest in the field of biblical archaeology type thing. But, I just tried to bounce the ball when it came my way along the way. Appreciate your attention very much.